He arrived on a Tuesday morning just after the school drop-off rush when the house still carried the remnants of breakfast coffee in the air, crumbs on the granite countertop, half-folded laundry beside the stairs. I hadn't expected him to be early. I hadn't expected him to be so present. Quiet, yes, but grounded, not like most people who step into someone else's home and shrink. He stood tall in our entryway, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and waited, not stiffly, not submissively, just waited like someone who knew how to take up space without being threatening. I shook his hand, said something polite, maybe even warm, though my voice sounded distant in my ears. His skin was warm, dry, firm. I remember the texture more than the words. My husband, Theodore, was already gone by then, the usual early train. It was me who stayed home, managed the schedules, the logistics, the invisible scaffolding that kept our lives from collapsing into chaos. Hiring a male nanny had been Theodore's idea. Someone athletic, he said, who can run around with him without burning out in 3 days. It made sense on paper. I hadn't pushed back. By noon, Elias had already taken our son Jasper to the park, read 2 books with him, and handled a minor tantrum with a kind of practiced calm that made me feel both grateful and vaguely replaced. I watched from the window as they walked back to the house, Jasper, usually dragging his feet, now skipping beside Elias. I was holding a dish towel and didn't realize I'd stopped wiping the counter. That evening after dinner, when the house exhaled into its quieter rhythm, I passed by the hallway that leads to the guest room where Elias would stay. I caught my reflection in the glass of the framed print. Bare feet, loose shirt, hair tied in a knot. Then another reflection behind me, Elias. He had paused at the end of the corridor holding a folded shirt. Our eyes met for less than 2 seconds. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But there was no confusion in that moment. He saw me, not the mother, not the wife, just me. I barely slept that night. The following days blurred into each other in a strangely heightened way. The routine was the same: breakfast, school, errands, emails. But everything had edges. Elias's presence in the house wasn't intrusive, but it was inescapable. I'd walk into a room and feel the shift in the air. Sometimes he'd be fixing a loose hinge, tying a shoelace, flipping pancakes. Sometimes he'd be silent, reading. But I was always aware of him. His movements were deliberate, never rushed. There was something about the way he bent to pick up a toy, the way his fingers brushed over surfaces, like they were speaking their own language. I found myself dressing differently. Nothing obvious, but I started choosing fabrics that felt good against my skin. I stopped reaching for the same worn sweater. One morning, I put on a silk camisole under a cardigan. No one saw it, but I knew it was there. That same night, I opened my drawer and stared at a pair of red lace underwear I hadn't worn in over a year. I wore them to bed. I don't want to pretend that what I felt was sudden. It wasn't lightning. It was something slower, thicker, like warm honey sliding down the inside of a glass. It collected in moments. The way Elias handed me a glass of water and his fingers grazed mine, the way he lingered before answering a question as if the space between words had weight. We didn't speak much, not directly, but the silence started to say things I wasn't ready to hear. I caught myself watching him when he wasn't looking. Then I started watching when he was. I wanted to know if he'd look back. And he did, not always, but enough. Enough to make me wonder if I was imagining it. Enough to hope I wasn't. Theodore didn't notice. He asked how the new nanny was doing and I said, fine. He kissed me on the cheek one night and thanked me for making lasagna. I smiled and told him he was welcome, then I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my face for 10 minutes. It didn't look any different, but everything underneath felt rearranged. One afternoon, I stood in the laundry room folding shirts when Elias passed behind me, reaching for a basket. The space between our bodies was narrow. Our arms brushed. I didn't move away. Neither did he. I don't even know if he noticed, but I did. I stood there, still holding a shirt, my heart loud in my ears. It wasn't attraction in the way people write about it. It wasn't lust in the simple sense. It was the feeling of being noticed without being asked to perform. It was the feeling of being a woman again in a life where I'd slowly become function. The caretaker, the scheduler, the steady one. I hadn't realized how invisible I'd become even to myself. That night as I lay in bed next to Theodore, I reached for my own wrist where Elias's skin had brushed mine earlier. I pressed my fingers there, trying to remember the exact sensation. It was barely a touch, but it lit up something in me that I couldn't switch off. And I knew, with the kind of knowing that lives deep in the bones, that this wasn't going away. This wasn't passing. Something had already shifted, and I wasn't ready to shift it back. It started with a cup, one of those heavy ceramic ones that Theodore never uses, the ones I bought because I liked the way they felt in my hands. Solid and a little imperfect. I was reaching for it from the drying rack, still in my robe, hair barely twisted up, when Elias entered the kitchen. The air still smelled like toasted sourdough and coffee grounds. The clink of dishes, the low hum of the fridge. Everything normal, too normal, except I could feel his presence before I saw him. He stepped beside me to grab the orange juice from the fridge, and when he turned, our bodies passed so closely I felt the heat radiating from his shoulder through my robe sleeve. My breath caught. I told myself it was nothing, but then he offered me the cup. My cup, holding it out with 2 fingers around the handle like it was something delicate. His hand brushed mine, a split-second contact, barely more than air, but my skin reacted like it had been burned. I held that cup too tightly for the next 10 minutes. The house was unusually quiet that morning. Jasper had gone to school early for a field trip. Theodore was already at work. The dishwasher had finished its cycle and the laundry machine was between loads. Silence, real silence, had settled over everything like fog. Elias was wiping the counters. I should have gone upstairs, should have taken a shower, started emails, anything. But I stayed, just stood there, holding a half-full cup and watching the way his back moved beneath the fabric of his shirt. Not overtly, not hungrily, but observantly. My eyes knew what they were doing, even if I pretended otherwise. I started asking myself questions I hadn't asked in years. When was the last time I'd been truly touched? Not in passing, not out of habit, but really touched. When had my skin mattered to anyone other than my esthetician? I had a marriage. I had a home. But my body had been on mute for so long that even this faint stir of recognition felt seismic. Later that evening, Theodore called to say he'd be staying overnight in Savannah due to a late client dinner. I gave the expected response, neutral and understanding, but a current flickered beneath the words, not because I suspected anything, he wasn't like that, but because something inside me had just been handed permission, a crack in the glass. I tucked Jasper into bed by 9. He read with Elias earlier and had fallen asleep quickly. The house dipped into that deep post-child hush. I cleaned up the toys, turned off the hallway light, passed by the guest room door. Closed, quiet. I wasn't going to knock. I wasn't even going to linger. But then I heard it, the faint click of the door opening behind me. My feet stopped before I had the chance to think. I turned. Elias was there in a dark t-shirt, barefoot, hair slightly tousled, the kind of casual that doesn't try to impress and therefore does. I left something in the laundry, he said. His voice was low, soft, almost too normal. He didn't move toward me, but he didn't back away either. I stepped aside. Neither of us filled the silence. I don't know who moved first. It doesn't matter. What matters is that suddenly we were in the narrowest part of the hallway between the guest room and the linen closet, and I felt the wall at my back and the electricity in the inches between us. His eyes didn't search mine, they held them. And then he kissed me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frenzied. It was a quiet kind of devastation, the kind that rearranges you before you realize you've changed. His mouth on mine felt like a question I hadn't allowed myself to ask in years. And in answering, I found a part of myself that had been asleep. I kissed him back fully, consciously, not out of accident or weakness, not out of recklessness, but because I wanted to. Because I had been waiting to feel something real, and this was real in a way that frightened me. The kiss ended. Neither of us said a word. I turned first, walked toward the stairs. My pulse was loud in my ears. My lips still tingled. I wasn't shaking. I was alive. In the bathroom I looked at myself in the mirror. My robe was slightly askew, collar loosened. I could still taste him. I didn't fix my hair. I didn't wash my face. I just stood there watching my own reflection as if I was seeing it for the first time. That night I lay in bed alone and replayed every detail, not with guilt but with astonishment. The way his fingers had briefly touched the side of my waist, the soft scrape of stubble against my chin, the stillness after. I expected shame. It didn't come. What came instead was clarity. There are things we tell ourselves to survive routine. We build marriages on compromise, on steadiness, on repetition. But no one tells you how hungry you can become for the smallest flicker of something unscripted. I didn't feel like I'd betrayed anyone, not yet. The betrayal, I realized, would be to pretend it hadn't mattered. And even as I turned off the light, even as the room swallowed me back into domestic silence, I knew I wouldn't pretend. Not to myself. Not anymore. I didn't sleep. I waited for morning. Not because I dreaded it, but because for the first time in a long time I wanted to see what it would bring. The irony of routine is how easily it disguises transformation. Everything outside looked unchanged. School drop-offs, conference calls, grocery lists, dry cleaning reminders. Even the way Elias greeted me the next morning with a nod, with that same calm cadence in his footsteps, seemed identical to the day before. But something had cracked quietly, like a hairline fracture in a glass pane, invisible at a glance but waiting for pressure. He didn't mention the kiss. Neither did I. And yet it hummed beneath every movement, every glance that lingered a fraction longer than it should. There was no awkwardness between us, only a kind of sharpened quiet. I noticed how aware I'd become of the spaces we occupied, how often Elias stood just far enough not to touch, how often he chose the side of the room opposite mine, like a man aware of his shadow, not avoiding, just waiting. It was Theodore who disrupted the symmetry. He came home that Thursday evening with an uncharacteristic smile, holding a printed brochure and car keys. "Last-minute idea," he said, his eyes too bright, like someone trying on spontaneity for the first time in years. "Let's drive up north, rent a place for the weekend, just us and Jasper." He added, nodding toward the hallway where Jasper had disappeared, "He's earned a change of scenery." I blinked. I hadn't seen it coming. Theodore never made impulsive suggestions. But maybe he felt the drift too. Maybe he'd seen something, heard something in my voice, in my silences. Or maybe it was just guilt in me, projecting onto his sudden enthusiasm. "Should we bring Elias?" I asked before I could stop myself. He shrugged. "Why not? If we want a little time to ourselves." It was a harmless suggestion, practical, logical, but it landed with weight. That Friday morning we packed hastily. Theodore loaded the trunk while I folded soft clothes into bags. Sweaters, leggings, a wool dress I hadn't worn in months. I packed for cold nights and fireside dinners, for long walks and short silences. I packed like someone trying to prepare for all the wrong moments. The drive was quieter than expected. Jasper dozed off quickly and Theodore focused on the road, on weather updates and podcast episodes. I sat in the back seat beside Jasper while Elias sat in the passenger seat, hands resting on his knees, eyes forward. We didn't speak, but I could see his reflection in the side mirror. The sharp line of his jaw, the unmoving curve of his mouth. When the road curved, our eyes met in that mirror. Neither of us flinched. The cabin was picture perfect, the kind of place designed for curated peace. Stone fireplace, oversized furniture, windows that stretched to the ceiling. Theodore seemed satisfied. He lit a fire, poured wine, played music from his phone. He was, in his way, trying. And I played along, moving through the motions like choreography I'd learned years ago. But inside my chest ached with contradiction. I wanted to be present. I wanted to be touched by his efforts. And yet all I could feel was the widening gap between what was happening and what I was capable of feeling. It wasn't about betrayal. It wasn't even about guilt. It was the slow realization that something essential had already left me, and I didn't know how to retrieve it. That night we ate by the fire, wrapped in wool blankets, Jasper tucked between us on the sofa. Elias took a quieter chair in the corner, a book open in his hands. He read, or pretended to, while I felt the pull of his presence like gravity. Once, when Theodore stood to check the thermostat, I turned my head slightly, just enough to catch the way Elias's eyes had been fixed on me. Not in hunger, not in accusation, in awareness. Later, everyone drifted off. Jasper to the lofted bedroom upstairs, Theodore to the shower. I stepped outside for air. The night was cold, the kind of cold that tightens skin and sharpens breath. The sky above was black, dotted with stars too far to matter. I hugged my cardigan tighter and walked along the wooden porch toward the side of the cabin where the light from the kitchen didn't reach. And then I heard it. Not footsteps, not words, just breath, just stillness. Elias was leaning against the sidewall, hands in his coat pockets, looking outward. I didn't startle. I didn't turn away. I stopped, several steps away, facing the same direction, as if we were two strangers who'd found themselves under the same stretch of sky. We didn't speak. We didn't touch. But the silence between us was different now. Dense, elastic, filled with the weight of everything we couldn't say. I wanted to ask him what he saw in me. I wanted to tell him that I hadn't meant for any of this to happen, but I also hadn't wanted to stop it. I wanted to confess the kind of ache that builds when you've been invisible for too long, when you've grown so used to absence that presence feels dangerous. Instead, I just stood there watching my own breath curl into the cold. After a moment, Elias turned back toward the porch door. He paused, not looking at me, just enough to let me feel his movement behind me, then slipped inside. I remained outside until the cold numbed the tips of my fingers. When I finally returned to the warmth of the cabin, Theodore was already asleep in bed, his body curved away from my side. I climbed in slowly, careful not to disturb the stillness, and I lay there wide-eyed, thinking not of what I had done but of what I hadn't, and how loudly the silence of restraint can echo inside a woman's chest. When we returned home Sunday evening, everything felt misaligned, like furniture slightly out of place after a stranger walked through your house. The walls were the same, the soft ticking of the kitchen clock still filled the quiet, but I no longer moved through the space with the same unconscious rhythm. Something inside had shifted, and it wasn't just guilt. It was a sense of distance from the version of myself who could live without touch, without heat, without the low ache I now carried beneath my ribs. I busied myself that first morning back, unpacking bags, scrubbing the tub, wiping cabinets that weren't dirty, anything to delay sitting still. But by Tuesday, routine clawed its way back. The rhythm of work, emails, after-school snacks, and folding clean clothes reasserted itself. Theodore had returned to his usual patterns as well. There was no mention of the trip, no reflection, just his usual efficiency. Calendar updates, reminders to call the insurance company, a brief conversation about refinancing. I should have been relieved, but the silence wasn't comfortable anymore. It was hollow. That afternoon, I drove to the grocery store in Savannah, forgetting the list on the counter, wandering the aisles with a basket I barely filled. I caught my own reflection in the freezer door, lips dry, hair too neat. I looked like someone waiting for a train that would never arrive. On the way home, I took a detour 10 blocks past the house. I turned into a parking lot I hadn't entered in months, the gym where I used to go before Jasper started school full-time. It was mostly empty on weekdays. I parked without planning to go inside, but I found myself at the front desk 10 minutes later, reciting my name, surprised that they still had me in the system. The scent of rubber mats and eucalyptus oil hit me immediately. I changed into leggings and a loose cotton tank I kept in the trunk for emergencies. It smelled faintly of an old perfume I used to wear, sweet, vanilla-based, naive. I didn't feel like that version of myself anymore. But I pulled my hair into a knot and stepped inside the nearly deserted studio. Elias was there. At first I wasn't sure. He wore a staff shirt, a towel slung casually over his shoulder, clipboard in one hand. He was talking to someone at the far end of the wait area. I didn't turn around. I didn't hide. I picked a treadmill near the corner and started walking, eyes on the screen, heart suddenly louder than the soft hum of machines around me. I didn't have to look to know when he saw me. The air changed just slightly, a flicker of recognition across the floor. But he didn't approach. He finished his conversation, crossed the gym, and disappeared behind the desk. It was only 15 minutes later, as I was wiping down the equipment, that I heard his voice behind me. "You haven't been here in a while." His tone was neutral, but there was something behind it. Not judgment, not surprise, just texture, like he was testing the weight of the moment with that one simple observation. I didn't turn. Things got busy. There was a pause. "You look different." I looked down at my arms, then at the mirror across the room. "Not sure if that's good or bad." "It's just true," he said. That was all. He walked away, but the words stayed. Back home, I sat on the edge of the bathtub and peeled off the gym clothes slowly, layer by layer. My skin was flushed. Not from exertion but from memory, from proximity, from being seen again in a place that wasn't domestic, wasn't choreographed. I slipped into the shower, water hitting too hot at first, then settling into something bearable. I didn't close my eyes. I let the water trace the edges of my collarbone, the soft curve of my stomach, the inner bend of my elbow, places that had gone unnoticed for too long. Later that evening, while folding towels in the bedroom, Theodore walked in. He leaned on the doorframe, watched me for a few seconds before stepping closer. He touched my shoulder gently, tentatively, and kissed the side of my neck. I didn't recoil. I didn't move toward him either. I waited. The kiss lasted only a moment. When he pulled back, he looked into my face like he was searching for something. I smiled, a small, polite smile, the kind you give to neighbors at the grocery store. "You smell good," he said. "I used the mint shampoo," I answered. He nodded, then left the room. I sat down on the bed, towel in my lap, fingers tracing its edge. There was no betrayal in what just happened, but there was no connection either. His touch didn't stir me. It didn't root itself beneath my skin. It was affectionate, routine, meant to say we're fine without actually checking if we were. I walked to the mirror near my closet, pulled open the drawer where I kept things I rarely wore anymore. My fingers hovered over a deep sapphire slip, then a bra with sheer lining I'd bought impulsively but never used. I chose the second, not because I expected anything but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to dress for sensation, not presentation. I put it on slowly, let the strap slide against my shoulder, adjusted it until it sat right. The fabric was soft, cool. I didn't look in the mirror to see if it was flattering. I already knew it was. Downstairs, the sound of a show playing in the background reached me faintly. Theodore's voice, laughing lightly at some punchline. The rhythm of evening continued, predictable, comfortable, intact. And yet I felt myself already drifting toward another current, quiet but undeniable. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I was already leaning toward it. I didn't plan it. I told myself that over and over, even as I waited a second longer than necessary at the window that overlooked the driveway, even as I reapplied lipstick, not the bold red I used to wear when we were first married, but a muted wine shade, subtle but intentional, even as I chose a blouse with pearl buttons that could be unfastened with one hand and a soft wool skirt that clung just enough to remind me I still had curves, still had control over them. It had been raining all morning. Not a thunderstorm, not the violent kind, just the steady gray drizzle that made everything feel heavier. Theodore was working from the office again that week. He had a breakfast meeting, lunch at a club, something with a former colleague in the afternoon. He kissed the top of my head in passing, murmured something about dinner, and disappeared through the front door before the kettle even whistled. By noon, the house had gone silent again. Jasper was at school and I had no errands, no appointments. I'd already cleaned the kitchen, reordered vitamins online, replied to every unread message with polite efficiency. But time didn't move. It lingered, thick and pressing, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Elias was supposed to leave at noon that day. Something about needing to pick up a replacement charger, a trip across Savannah, but he'd forgotten his keys. Or maybe not. I'll never know for certain. I saw him from the window, returning across the slick stone path, his jacket unzipped, his hair damp, clinging slightly to his forehead. He looked up just before reaching the porch. Our eyes met for a second through the glass, just enough. I didn't move. I didn't wave. But I didn't look away. When the doorbell rang, I waited a heartbeat longer than I should have, then I opened it. "You forgot these," I said, holding out the keys. My voice sounded even. He stepped inside, out of the rain, and reached for them. The space between our hands shrank and then disappeared. My fingers brushed his palm when I let go. Not deliberately, but not entirely by accident either. "Thanks," he said, his voice lower than usual. His eyes didn't drop. They stayed on mine for a second too long, then slipped toward the collar of my blouse, the barely open buttons, the rhythm of breath beneath. I could have closed the door. I could have stepped back. But instead I turned toward the hallway. "Do you want a towel?" I asked, not waiting for an answer as I walked to the closet and pulled one from the middle shelf. He followed. I could feel it. I heard the soft sound of the door clicking shut behind him. When I turned, he was there, still close enough now that I could smell the rain on his jacket, the faint scent of soap clinging to his skin. I held out the towel. He took it, but neither of us moved. His hands were warm, still damp. Mine were shaking slightly. And then he leaned forward, not abruptly, not hungrily, but like something final had just clicked into place, and kissed me. This kiss wasn't like the one in the hallway days earlier. That had been a collision, a question. This was an answer, full-bodied, deliberate, deep. I felt his hand on the side of my neck, fingers resting gently beneath my jaw. My knees weakened. I didn't resist. I wanted this. Not just the kiss, but the sensation of being devoured and worshipped in equal measure. The feeling of a mouth on mine that wasn't conditioned by routine, that didn't kiss out of obligation or assumption, that kissed because it wanted to. We broke apart only when breath demanded it. I stepped back slightly, heart pounding. The room felt darker than before, the air thicker. "I should go," he said. "You should," I replied. But neither of us moved. He watched me for another few seconds. Not in challenge, not in guilt, just seeing, like trying to memorize something. Then he turned and left without another word. The silence he left behind was loud. I stood alone in the entryway, the towel still clutched in one hand. The fabric was slightly damp where his fingers had touched it. I ran my thumb across it absently, trying to steady myself. In the mirror near the coat hooks, I caught my reflection. Hair loose now, blouse still open at the collar, lips swollen and slightly red, not from makeup, not anymore. I didn't feel guilty. I felt lit up, like a room that had gone dark for too long and now remembered what electricity was. Later that evening, Theodore returned early, unexpectedly early. He brought takeout from my favorite place in Savannah. Gyoza, miso soup, jasmine rice. He didn't usually remember the details, but this time he did. "I thought we could have a quiet night," he said, setting the bag on the counter. "You've seemed distracted lately." I hesitated, smiled. "Thanks, that's sweet." While he unpacked the food, he pulled something small from his coat pocket. A black velvet box. I froze. "I saw this in a shop window last week," he said. "Didn't plan to buy it. Just something told me to." Inside was a lingerie set. Deep burgundy, delicate lace, not the kind of thing he ever bought me. "You deserve to feel beautiful," he added. I touched the fabric lightly. It was soft, detailed, thoughtful, but not the reason my skin tingled. "Thank you," I said quietly, and I meant it. But in that moment, standing in the kitchen with the man I married, holding a gift meant to awaken something in me, all I could think about was the kiss from earlier. The warmth of it still lived in my body like a low flame. The tragedy wasn't that Theodore had done something wrong. It was that someone else had already touched the place in me that gift was meant to reach, and that place was no longer his. We didn't talk about the gift again. I folded it neatly into the drawer beside the rest of the lace that rarely saw daylight. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate the gesture. It was thoughtful, kind, even a quiet attempt to bridge something he must have felt widening between us. But the gesture, like so many others before it, came from a place of theory, like he'd read an article titled, "How to Reignite Intimacy in Marriage," and decided to act on it, skipping the part where you ask your partner what they actually want. He didn't ask. Instead, he poured wine the next evening and lit candles at dinner. He brought up places we hadn't visited in years. Charleston, Jackson Hole, Barcelona. Before the baby. "We should plan something," he said between bites of roasted chicken. "Just as like before." I nodded, taking a sip of my drink even though I wasn't thirsty. "Maybe." The word hung there, gentle but non-committal. He didn't press. He rarely did. He'd always assumed that my silence meant agreement. That's the danger in long relationships. You stop listening to the space between the words. That night he reached for me in bed. The touch wasn't unexpected. There had been signals. The wine, the way his hand lingered on the small of my back when I passed him the salt. The subtle way he kept the bedroom door shut when we turned in for the night. It wasn't clumsy and it wasn't desperate. It was practiced. His movements were measured, like someone retracing steps in a well-worn dance. I let him. I didn't resist. I even kissed him back, allowed my hands to move where they were supposed to move, made sounds at the appropriate moments. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what this used to feel like. His skin, his weight, his breath near my ear. But my body stayed quiet. Not unresponsive, just absent, like I was borrowing someone else's experience, like I was watching it all happen from outside myself. Afterward, he curled into me, murmured something about how it had been too long, how he needed more nights like this. I smiled into the dark, my eyes wide open, blinking at the ceiling fan. I waited for sleep to take him before I slipped out of bed. Downstairs, the house was heavy with silence. I poured a glass of water I didn't need and stood by the window, staring into the backyard. The trees swayed slightly in the breeze, their branches brushing against one another like lovers in the dark. There was a faint glow from the guest house, the one we used for storage and occasional visitors. The light was low, warm, not bright enough to suggest activity but not forgotten either. I stood there for a long time, the condensation on the glass cooling my palm, my bare feet pressing into the tile. My skin still held the residue of contact, of closeness, but it didn't belong to me. It felt borrowed. The next morning I sent a message, short, plain. "Can you come earlier today?" Elias replied within minutes. "Sure. What time?" 9 if that's okay. Of course. No emojis, no hesitation. I spent more time getting dressed than I usually did. Not for him, at least that's what I told myself. I put on a charcoal gray dress, the one with the subtle slit and the long sleeves that hugged my arms just enough. Underneath, I chose a dark teal set with scalloped edges and mesh panels. Something I'd bought a year ago, worn once, then tucked away like a promise I couldn't keep. I curled my hair lightly, enough to give it shape without drawing attention. I dabbed perfume low on my neck, between my ribs, the insides of my wrists. The scent wasn't heavy. It was warm, with amber and vanilla, a trace of something soft and sinful. At 9:03 the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Elias didn't smile. Neither did I. He stepped inside, the rain from earlier still clinging to the hem of his jacket. I offered coffee. He declined. I asked about his morning. He said it was quiet. We didn't mention the kiss. We didn't acknowledge the shift. He took off his coat and moved through the house like he always did. Efficient, steady, present. I watched him from the kitchen, fingers grazing the edge of the marble island, heartbeat louder than the sound of the clock above the stove. He passed by me on the way to the hallway. Our arms didn't touch. Our bodies didn't collide. But the current between us flared, unmistakable. There were words at the back of my throat, things I wanted to say. I think about it every day. I don't regret it. I'm scared of how much I want it to happen again. But I didn't speak. Neither did he. Not then. But later, as I walked him to the front door, the space between us collapsed again. He turned toward me just as I reached for the handle. We stood too close again, always just a breath away from the boundary neither of us named. "You're different today," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a diagnosis. I didn't answer and I didn't open the door. Instead, I stood there, letting the silence stretch between us like a thread pulled too tight. My hand brushed against his lightly once and then I turned, walking back down the hallway without another word, leaving him standing there alone in the entryway. I didn't look back, but I didn't have to, because I knew he was watching. It was a Wednesday when the house finally gave us what it hadn't before. Silence, not of routine but of absence, the kind that doesn't just hush noise but erases the possibility of interruption. Theodore had left early, a conference out of town. Jasper was at his grandmother's for a few nights. The plan had come together last minute, an overlap of schedules that hadn't happened in over a year. I didn't interfere. I didn't encourage it either. I just let it happen. That morning I woke before the alarm, already knowing what the day would feel like. The air was dense, warm, despite the early chill. I took longer in the shower than I needed. I shaved my legs, not because anyone would notice but because I would. I wore a navy cashmere sweater, thin enough to reveal the outline of my bra, and a long skirt that clung at the hips and softened around the knees. My underwear was black, sheer in the right places, cut lower than anything practical. I didn't rush through makeup. I chose lipstick one shade deeper than what I usually wore. Everything looked effortless but none of it was. Elias arrived at 9:02 right on time. He stepped inside with that same quiet gravity he always carried, as though the world around him bent inward slightly but respectfully. He asked if I needed anything. I said no. I told him the day was open, that I had nowhere to be. He only nodded. There was no change in his expression, no flicker of assumption or expectation. We moved through the house like usual. He picked up stray toys, folded blankets, checked the batteries in the smoke detector that had been blinking red for days. I wiped counters that didn't need wiping. I rearranged fruit in the bowl. We didn't speak much, but something had changed in the spaces between. He entered the living room while I was still standing by the window, watching the light shift across the hardwood floor. He paused when he saw me, not dramatically, just long enough for it to mean something. I turned toward him, arms crossed lightly, eyes meeting his without the buffer of conversation. I didn't invite. I didn't move. But I didn't break eye contact either. He sat on the arm of the chair near the fireplace, casual, comfortable, as if he'd done it 100 times. The way his body curved there, framed by the tall back of the chair and the morning light spilling through the blinds, made him look like part of the room, like something always meant to be here. "What are you thinking?" he asked finally, voice low, steady. I swallowed. "That it's quiet. Too quiet. The kind you notice." He nodded slowly, eyes still on mine. "You seem different. You said that last time." "I meant it more today." There was a pause, not heavy, just full. "What do you see?" I asked, almost without realizing it had left my mouth. He didn't answer right away. Then he stood, crossed the room, stopped 2 feet from where I stood, close enough for the heat between us to resurface. "I see someone trying very hard not to say what she already knows." I inhaled slowly. The words landed somewhere deep, like stepping into a memory you hadn't planned to revisit. I felt them in my chest, in the back of my knees, in the low pulse between my ribs. I turned away, not in retreat but in surrender. I walked to the edge of the kitchen island, ran my fingers over the marble, felt its cool, perfect indifference. Behind me, I could feel his eyes on the curve of my back, the way the sweater dipped slightly at my shoulder, the way the hem of my skirt fluttered around my calves. We stayed like that for a long moment. Then he moved closer. One step, then another, until his body was near enough that I could feel the warmth of it behind mine, the breath between us not yet touching but alive. He didn't reach for me. He didn't have to. His presence pressed into me like gravity, quiet, insistent. My hands tightened on the counter. I leaned back slightly, not enough to make contact but enough to make the absence of it feel unbearable. "I should go," he murmured. "You won't," I said. Silence again, but not the kind that demanded explanation, the kind that spoke for itself. He left 10 minutes later, without touch, without a kiss, but everything inside my skin buzzed with the echo of him. That evening, after the sky dimmed and the light in the house shifted to warm golds and shadows, I opened the drawer again. The burgundy set Theodore had given me was still neatly folded, untouched. I left it where it was. Instead, I pulled out what I had worn earlier, the black set, still faintly scented with perfume. I held the fabric against my palm, ran a finger along the lace edge. I wasn't confused. I wasn't ashamed. What I felt was more dangerous. I felt anticipation, not for what might happen but for what I now knew I wanted to happen again and again. And that knowledge, more than any kiss or touch, was what changed everything. Because it wasn't just about Elias anymore. It was about me, and I was no longer pretending not to want. It wasn't a fight. There weren't any raised voices, no slammed doors or accusations flung across the kitchen like broken plates. That's what made it worse. The absence of chaos made the truth clearer, sharper. Because when love dies quietly, it doesn't give you anything to blame. You're just left with the silence and the long, slow process of watching someone try to fix something you've already buried. Theodore lit candles that night, played music from the Bluetooth speaker tucked above the refrigerator. Not classical, not jazz, something modern and soft, an algorithm-generated attempt at romance. He uncorked a bottle of wine we'd been saving for a special night, though we'd never defined what that meant. The smell of garlic and butter filled the house. He made shrimp scampi my favorite. He wore the shirt I once told him looked best on him. Everything felt arranged, curated, as if he were setting a stage for something neither of us could quite perform anymore. I knew what he was trying to do. He wasn't stupid. He'd felt the distance growing. He couldn't name it, couldn't see the shape of the absence, but he could smell the rot at the edges, and this tonight was his attempt at cutting it out before it spread too far. A desperate kind of tenderness, not the romantic gesture of a man in love, but the tactical maneuver of a man sensing threat. I went along with it. I let him fill my glass, laughed when the oil sputtered too loudly from the pan, nodded when he suggested we take a weekend away, just the two of us. He even mentioned a place by the coast we hadn't visited since our honeymoon. His voice trembled on the word, honeymoon, as if the memory itself had teeth. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said, his eyes on his plate. "Not mine." I swallowed, felt the wine settle heavily in my chest. "I've just been tired." "You're always tired now." I didn't reply. Because he wasn't wrong. Later, as we moved through the cleanup routine, him rinsing, me drying, it almost felt like a dance we remembered. The choreography was still in our bodies, even if the meaning was gone. He stepped behind me at the sink, hands on my waist, fingers lightly pressing against my hips. "I miss this," he said. "This us." I turned my head just slightly, enough to see him in my peripheral vision. "You don't even know what us is anymore." He paused, visibly stung, but said nothing. And that silence said more than he realized. That night we didn't make love, but he touched me in bed, under the covers. His hand found my arm, then my hip, then my thigh. His kisses were soft, searching. I let him. I didn't move away, but I didn't meet him there either. My body absorbed the contact without offering anything in return. It felt like being wrapped in someone else's coat, familiar warmth, wrong smell. When he finally fell asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The fan moved in slow circles, each rotation like a slow pendulum swinging through a countdown I didn't know had started. At some point past midnight, I slipped out of bed and padded down the hallway barefoot. The tiles were cold against my soles, grounding. I didn't turn on the lights. I knew the layout of the house better than I knew the layout of my own mind these days. Outside, the backyard was drenched in moonlight. Pale silver washed across the grass, the empty patio chairs, the edge of the pool cover. I walked toward the guest house, pausing when I saw the glow under the curtain. The light was on. I didn't knock. I didn't open the door either. I stood there, heart in my throat, eyes fixed on that narrow slice of light spilling onto the grass. I imagined Elias inside, seated at the desk, maybe reading, maybe staring at nothing. I imagined him pausing when he heard footsteps, his head lifting, the stillness that would follow. I raised my hand, not quite touching the door but close. My fingers hovered near the wood. The night air curled around my ankles. I could feel the weight of the decision pressing on my shoulders, in the shallow hollow of my collarbone, in the sudden tightness in my chest. But I didn't move, not forward, not back. I stayed there, suspended between want and restraint, my breath shallow, my thoughts a blur of reasons and denials. Inside the house, everything was intact. Theodore slept. Jasper's toys were still scattered beneath the couch. The bed was made. The calendar on the fridge marked an upcoming anniversary with a small heart. Outside, under that light, a part of me waited to be claimed, not by Elias, not even by the kiss we hadn't repeated, but by the version of myself I wasn't sure I could still return to. I lowered my hand and stepped back. I didn't go inside. But the next time I knew I would. Morning arrived like a soft intrusion, slipping through the sheer curtains and settling over the room in warm, reluctant light. I'd left the window cracked overnight, and the breeze stirred faintly through the fabric, carrying with it the earthy scent of damp grass and something older. Dust, wood, air that hadn't been touched in years. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind that insists on being noticed. I got up before anyone else, pulled on a robe without thinking, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The tiles were cold, grounding in a way I didn't realize I needed. I moved carefully, not because I feared waking anyone, but because there was a sacredness to that hour, something heavy but delicate, like I was being watched by the day itself. I made coffee, not because I wanted it but because it gave me something to do. The hiss of the machine, the slow drip, the familiar smell. Domestic rituals that used to make me feel safe. I stood there holding the warm mug, not drinking, just listening. The house didn't speak back. Theodore had taken the day off. He mentioned it casually over dinner the night before, saying he needed a slow morning. The tone in his voice had been different. less performative than usual, as if he'd surrendered to something unnamed. I hadn't asked questions. We both understood there was a limit to the comfort routine could offer. I glanced at the hallway. The bedroom door was still closed. I walked to the front door still in my robe and opened it quietly. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the driveway. I stepped outside without shoes, feeling the texture of stone beneath my feet, the leftover dampness from the night clinging to the soles. The grass was cool. The sky was cloudless. There was no breeze. Then I saw him. Elias was coming up the sidewalk, casual as always, his hands in the pockets of his coat, his gaze scanning the trees before landing on me. He didn't smile. Neither did I. But we both paused, that kind of pause that doesn't seek drama, only recognition. I didn't wave. I didn't gesture. But I didn't go back inside either. He stopped a few steps away from me, close enough that I could see the sleep still softening the edges of his eyes, the faint indentation of a pillow on his cheek that hadn't completely faded. I didn't ask why he was early and he didn't explain. We stood there in silence, morning light spilling between us like a third presence. Then I stepped forward only once. My hand brushed his as I passed him. Not a grasp, not a plea, just the briefest, most deliberate contact, skin to skin, warmth to warmth, like a promise already made in another language. He said nothing and neither did I. I walked past him around the side of the house, where the trash bin stood crooked against the fence and the garden hose curled like a sleeping snake. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the echo of him along the back of my shoulders, the pulse of his breath in the air that had already touched my face. Inside the house the clock ticked too loudly. The refrigerator hummed. The corners of the living room were still filled with the life we'd built. Framed photos, crayon drawings held to the wall with tape, throw pillows that never stayed in place. And in the mirror by the staircase I caught my own reflection. My hair unbrushed, my robe slightly open at the collar, my cheeks pink from the morning air. But my eyes looked back at me like they'd finally found something solid to rest on. Later, Theodore emerged from the bedroom. He was quiet, not cold. He kissed me on the forehead, murmured something about making breakfast. I nodded, let him pass. I watched his back, the way the hem of his shirt curled at his hips, the way he scratched the back of his neck when he yawned. He wasn't the villain. He never had been. He just wasn't the place I lived in anymore. He scrambled eggs, toasted bread, asked about plans for the weekend. I answered with practiced ease. Then he reached across the table and placed his hand gently over mine. "You seem better," he said. "More yourself." I looked at him for a long moment, then gave the softest smile I could manage. Maybe I am. But what I didn't say, what sat just beneath the surface of my skin, quiet and certain, was that I had found that self elsewhere, in spaces he didn't touch, in silences he never heard. That night I opened the drawer beside the bed. The lingerie Theodore had bought still sat there untouched. I ran my fingers over the lace. It was beautiful, delicate, chosen with care. But it wasn't for me, not anymore. I closed the drawer. I turned off the light. And I slept deeper than I had in years.